Soundstripe.
Hi, I would like to welcome all of you to this online Library of Liberty discussion. Today, rather than focusing on one particular text, we thought it would be fun to get together with a couple of friends to talk about horror and the history of horror and the way that horror has been presented over the centuries as part of human entertainment and human exploration. My name is Sarah Skwire, and I am with the Online Library of Liberty at Liberty Fund. And I have with me here today my friend Garth Bond, who is Associate Professor of English at Lawrence University, and Adam Simon, who is a director, producer, and screenwriter. He's co-creator of the television series Salem, and I believe also responsible for the film Carnosaur.
Okay, you pulled that one out.
Pulled that one out there.
There we go.
That's a good title. We had to get that one in there. So welcome to both of you, and thanks for agreeing to take a little bit of time out of your day to hang out and talk about horror. I got thinking about horror recently because there was a new film out of Macbeth, which the two of us have talked about, which Garth has written about a bit for the Online Library of Liberty blog, The Reading Room. And what's interesting to me about Macbeth is that in many ways it's a horror story, and it's a horror story that has lasted for hundreds of years. It was scary when Shakespeare wrote it. It was horrifying when Shakespeare wrote it, and it is horrifying to us now. And that's interesting to me because it seems to me, particularly with Shakespeare and with older texts in general, the funny stuff doesn't stay funny for very long. And the horrifying and the frightening stay horrifying and they stay frightening. And maybe that's a good place to start with thinking about horror. Why does horror last when comedy dissolves almost as soon as we create it? Or am I wrong about that? I could be completely wrong.
I could jump in. I mean, it's a great observation and a great question. One of my close neighbors, you can't see, but a few houses down the street here in Santa Monica, is a guy who was one of the great comedians of the 90s and into the early 2000s. You know, if you didn't remember his name, you'd recognize his face. He had the distinction when David Letterman retired and did his sort of last month on TV of being brought on multiple times because he had been the stand-up who had been on Letterman more than any other stand-up, more than his friends and contemporaries, Seinfeld, Ray Romano, whoever were the other big names of that moment. The big difference being he had not had it. His persona never transformed into a sitcom. Mm-hmm. I say that to say that he and I have actually had this discussion as kind of the clown and the tragedian, you know, sitting in the backyard talking about that and about how tricky it is for the humor to last. It's not entirely true. I think we've all laughed at some old things, you know, but you're right, the topicality of that. There's the distinction I think you got to make early on, and I want to see what, you know, Garth, what you think about that. But there's lots of layers that are happening in horror, as there are with everything. But there's no doubt that on the one hand, at the deepest level of it, and by deepest, I don't mean most profound, even if I mean literally almost at the deepest level. There's a lot of work that's been done in the last years on kind of the, for want of a better and less whatever academic sounding phrase, sort of the evolutionary biology of horror, and linking horror experiences to literally the structure of the brain and our built-in psychophysiological responses, for example. Literally, there's whole areas of specialties in that in terms of horror studies. I mean, not in terms of kind of content-driven and my own orientation of a kind of more symbolic orientation of what, you know, horror is, but literally in terms of physiologically what it does to you. And its roots in how critical these folks would say our own experience as whatever it would be, hundreds of thousands, millions of years of being essentially a major prey rather than major predator, right? I mean, we're dealing with the anomaly at core there, which is already a horrifying thought of how is it that this basically, what did Aristotle, is it Aristotle who has called us the featherless biped or whatever, when trying to, however you want to define what a human being is, it doesn't make any sense that we should end up being the alpha predator. In fact, we spent most of, human existence in a dangerous world surrounded by true alpha predators like giant bears and creatures and lions and tigers. So there's a whole school of thought that says, hey, horror is actually rooted in this fundamental, truly archaic experience of being eaten, devoured, the night being inherently dangerous, the ground being dangerous, the forest being dangerous. And there's a good argument made that all these certain key building block tropes of horror, come from something not merely archetypal in a kind of psychic sense, but in a physiological sense. That is, as with our limbic system and our lizard brain. So at that most deepest level, there's that. And that's always in horror, whether it's something as simple as a jump scare or this, why we're afraid of the dark, or why we're afraid of being eaten, or why we're afraid of giant creatures, and all these kinds of things. So there's that level, and that's eternal, right? That's outside of time in some sense, and it's going to be true. And we believe it's sort of transcultural, presumably. And it should be said, yes, that from a purely business point of view, also as a Hollywood creature, it's been well known there are certain genres that travel and certain genres that don't. In eras when, half or more of a revenue stream of something comes from an international audience, that has a big weight on the films. Certain kinds of films travel. Horror films travel. There's a whole other rabbit hole we could get into of how the great foreign filmmakers who came to this country, say, between the wars, back in the 20th century, those wars, why horror was one of the main things they created when they came here. Horror and suspense and certain kinds of things that are linked like that, whether that be Hitchcock or Fritz Lang or Murnau or all these folks who that's what they had been doing, because it's simply international in a way that comedies don't travel. So that's in the same way they don't necessarily travel through time, they don't even necessarily travel through space, because they may be dealing with these more ephemeral things. Other than, for example, slapstick, purely physical comedy, which would be like the limbic equivalent in comedy of what we were talking about with horror. But there's other layers on top of that. But I want to come back to those and throw it to you, Garth. But to start with that it's a physical substrate that's the guarantor of that.
That's really interesting, because one of the things that I was thinking about, sort of thinking up to this conversation, was that there was a brief time in graduate school where I toyed with working on film, and there aren't that many theoretical texts from grad school that continue to resonate with me deeply, but definitely one idea that I remember from film studies was, I believe Linda Williams talked about the idea of body genres, which is really getting at the same sort of
Yes.
idea that you're talking about, that there are films, and I think there are probably genres of literature as well, that are trying to create a bodily response. Slapstick comedy is one of them.
Yeah.
Horror is one of them. I mean, pornography is probably sort of like the I was going to say most explicit. That's probably not. At any rate, that resonates with me. I really like your way of tying it to more scientific ways of thinking about the body, and the body as an evolved body, as a way of explaining why we do have these jumps, why we have physical reactions to certain sorts of things that are in a way hardwired into us as a species.
I know very much the essay you're talking about. I'm trying to remember it's been an excerpt in lots of contexts, but and I thought about it many times within my own career, because it's the point she makes, she really points to in particular three genres, in a way, if you want to call them genres: horror, yes, porn, and romance. And she's really talking about tears, blood, and etc. Yeah. In terms of literally, she talks about the idea of the fluids, and she says it's not a coincidence that those are, how can we say it? These are not exactly considered the most elevated of genres. And in fact, one of them is kind of, not considered a real genre at all. But that what we think of as romance, or what for most of Hollywood history was called the women's picture. And I just spent a wonderful weekend at a fantastic film noir festival that they have every year. We hadn't had for a few years because of COVID, that they did for the first time again this year. And it focused a lot on kind of almost female noir, which gets into almost a kind of horror area.
It's interesting, isn't it? I'm just thinking about this now because I just had a discussion recently with another English professor and then a lawyer about the great Wilkie Collins novel, The Law and the Lady, which you could look at as a classic early domestic horror novel in a lot of ways. And it's interesting how that genre of women's fiction and horror overlaps, right? And that whole domestic horror genre, right? Which 21st century horror guys like to turn on their heads a lot of the time, right? But that woman in peril stuff is really deep. And it crosses all three of those genres really frequently.
It does. It breaks the center of it. And yes, that's part of what she's raised, this idea of sort of the female body being at the center of that and the issues of that. And we could equally say, well, yes, you could tie that to traditions within tragedy and other genres of kind of the status of and what happens to the female body. But the other thing you're raising there, Sarah, which we'll come back to for sure, I guarantee you, because it's a bête noire obsession of mine, it has to do with the Gothic and whatever we mean by the Gothic, and all the modern genres. And again, we have to think of the genres in the sense we're talking about them as separate from the ancient forms of genre, right? It's a very late creation, this idea of horror as a genre, or romance, or mystery, or whatever. But how many, almost all of those do come out of whatever we meant by the Gothic, and whatever we meant by it, kind of vulnerable, frightened, endangered females are at the heart of it. The other thing I was going to throw up there before we leave Linda's tripartite, romance, porn, and horror, I also want us to come back, and we will, I promise to push us back to that, to look at a particular moment, kind of post-Enlightenment, when what I think of as real horror is only starts to be possible, and things that both Garth and Sarah, I've touched on in previous conversations of the real relevance that the genre of horror has for ideas about liberty and original liberalism and stuff, and why it comes about in that time. That if you think about a text like the one that Garth, you and I met, being able to talk about Dangerous Liaisons, or its more unspeakable cousins like All of Desaad. These are narratives that actually combine those three that Linda Williams is talking about, right? That those are horror stories that are also on the edge of being, if not erotic, if not porn, then quote unquote erotica, and that are clearly also women's, in our sense, fictions too. I think we should come back to why that at that moment horror comes out. But I wanted to throw one more thing out to you guys, that when I said like that physiological level is like the deepest, the why am I scared in the dark and in the woods and all of that. I think there's a middle level of it, call it the one level up, I don't know, in the consciousness of it, the sort of psychic level and the emotional and psychological levels, in which a lot of the core of horror, and you pointed straight to this, Sarah, by starting this discussion with Macbeth. And I want to think about in terms of even its earlier models, in terms of just tragedy, okay, which was one of the primal genres, right, is tragedy. And it's not a genre that we talk about as a genre, in a sense.
Mm-hmm.
And I certainly would argue that there's no doubt that on all kinds of levels, after a certain moment in time, that's what horror is, that horror is modern tragedy. In the way that if you go back to a moment where there's kind of only comedy or tragedy, in a way, that is a kind of happy ending towards marriage and life, or a unhappy ending towards death and transfiguration, with obvious spiritual exceptions, that horror is not separable from that. Or as I sometimes think about it, because I'm a huge fan and also practitioner of the genre of romance, that these primal forms of either happy ever after or happy never after. And I think if we could sit here and recite the major high concept plots of the great works of Sophocles or Aeschylus or whoever, and if I went into a studio now or went to Netflix now to pitch a series, they'd be like, oh, that's domestic horror, or that's, family horror. I mean, or a film like Hereditary, or anyway, there's lots of examples, you could get to. So there is this really eternal part. But one last thing I want to throw to you guys, though, it feels to me, though, that there's a certain moment that things are different. And I'm interested in the moment when horror becomes horror as we know it in this context, that in ancient works, and I suppose I would turn to you guys to know, is this true as late as Shakespeare? I don't know. When a monster appears, whether that be the Cyclops on the island, right? Or the magical abilities that happen in something as late as, Midsummer Night's Dream, waking up with a horse's head, not in your bed like The Godfather, but on your shoulders.
Comedy version, not horror version. Yeah.
Exactly. But in any of those cases, there's a world there where events that we would think of, or I could depict to you as being horror events, and they may function on that lowest level of physiological horror, in the sense that imagine you're listening to Homer or whoever his stand-in was reciting those moments in the Odyssey when they're trapped in Cyclops's cave and having to figure out how to get away from this one-eyed monster who's going to eat them, right? And this is pure horror from our point of view. But the one thing that never happens in those chapters in the Odyssey is the first thing that would happen if it was a horror story in our sense, which is somebody going, oh my effing God, there's a giant with only one eye. How can such things be? The question's never asked before a certain point when confronting the monster or the horror element of that this somehow challenges the nature of reality itself, because their reality contains such supernatural, spiritual, whatever you want to call them, such things.
Yeah, now Garth and I have to play the English professor game of, can we think of when's the first minute we can think of that happening?
Because to me, that's the key. That would be the question. I want to know that answer, because I think you don't get what we think of as horror until you get the disbelief in the underlying things of it. And it's why we spend so much time in horror movies having characters try to figure out what's happening and how could it be true.
I mean, to me, this is purely speculative, and I'm sure there is something before this that would qualify. But I think before the Enlightenment provides a kind of sensibility that allows you to say there's nothing miraculous in the world, and therefore there should be nothing spectacularly horrific. Horrific is not the right word, but like that they're not that everybody expected a dragon to actually show up at their house, but within stories, there's not a sense that the miraculous needs to be explained away because that can't be a part of the real world. I mean, that would just be my guess, that it's somewhere in the 17th, 18th century. There's some kind of shift. I don't know, Sarah, does that sound?
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking there are moments in Shakespeare where you get expressions of horror that human behavior can be what it is.
Yep.
But it doesn't tend to be horror over monsters. It's, oh my God, how could Titus Andronicus have done the sorts of things that he did? Or, Macbeth, my mind is supped full of horrors, right? And there's this sense of like the human world can be shockingly horrific and inappropriate. But so I wonder whether, like, I'm starting to think about travel tales, right? Which is where you encounter your great 16th, 17th, 18th century kind of monsters, right?
Yeah.
And 16th and 17th century travel tales tend, and this is, I'm going to go way out on a limb here, and people are going to argue with me, and that's fine because I'm probably wrong. But in my head canon is that 16th and 17th century travel tales are like, oh my God, look at the freaky monsters, right? We left our known map of the world, and now we have the anthropophagi who do each other eat, and the men whose heads do grow beneath their shoulders, and we have those guys. 18th century travel tales are more about, we left like our map of France or England, and we went to this exotic locale, and gosh, they're exactly like us, right? They have these different customs that overlay it, but you know, Persian letters is about the French court, you know, travel tales are really about who we are. So there's this 18th century sense of the world being explainable, largely explainable, and human behavior, and even the really weird stuff being largely explainable if you just look at it long enough. So I think there is something about that. But also, there's still, I mean, I don't want to discount the fact that there's still so much stuff that is genuinely horrific that's way earlier. I was saying to Garth before you came into the conversation, Adam, you know, we are in the middle of Passover, right? And what do? The 10 plagues. Right?
Plagues.
One of the great earliest horror stories we have, right? You know,
Yes, but
rivers turning into blood, the slaughter of the firstborn. I mean, you know, it's everything bad all in one place. It's everything terrifying.
Well, and it raises what's really dangerous about horror, in the sense that once you get, I'm having trouble even articulating kind of how I'd want to say that, but that's always that moment in the Haggadah, that moment in the Seder when we recite those, right? And we're taking a drop of wine for each, putting it out for each of these awful plagues. And Sarah, you are 1000% correct. If you think about it, that could be a whole studio's output for 10 years of horror movies. First we'll do frogs, then we'll do blood, and then we're gonna do the river, turn to blood. This is bad.
Cattle disease was a slow one, though.
It's a slow one, but it works. That would be the X-Files episode. All the cattle's dead. You know, the UFO came. Up through the death of the firstborn. I mean, all the most horrible ones. What's potentially at stake in the horror, even in this pre-Enlightenment state of it, is the nature of reality itself. And if you're in a theocentric, I don't know what's the right term for it, when you're in a believing universe, that's either about, oh my goodness, the evil powers above us, grabbing control, and whatever's happening here being a reflection of some fight between sort of the good and evil powers that run us. I mean, the remnants of that are still in what we often think of or call kind of Catholic horror, in a way, like The Exorcist, possession stories, and any even modern horror stories that still rely on fundamentally a Christian or a Judeo-Christian or a very specific kind of spiritual mythology of a set of rules of who's in charge. And even there's big questions, obviously, that it raises about, why does God allow this terrible thing to happen? All that sort of stuff, right? So here's an image for you. My lodestar, whatever, my magnetic north or whatever within horror, certainly since childhood, has always been H.P. Lovecraft, and we can come back to why Lovecraft is such an important figure in the evolution of horror, and why he's become arguably the dominant, about 100 years after most of his stories were written. He's become, strangely, in ways he could never have imagined, the single most influential kind of horror. One of his early fundamental stories, probably written almost exactly 100 years ago, is called The Picture in the House, I believe. And a traveler in the woods outside of either Arkham or Innsmouth or one of Lovecraft's imaginary New England towns stumbles onto this weird cabin. I mean, so it's got all kinds of tropes that we're still used to now. The cabin in the woods turns out to be inhabited by a creepy old hermit. When he goes in there, at first there's nobody in there. There's creepy stuff in there. The furniture looks kind of odd. There's strange, both attractive and yet repulsive smells. But in particular, what happens, and the key thing in there, is that he sees books that he doesn't expect to find in a rustic cabin in the woods, and in particular, a giant old bound book. And Lovecraft is very explicit about specifically what book it is. And the narrator is describing looking at the book, and particularly looking at these large illustrations in it, which are utterly transfixing to him. And he's explicit about what the illustration is and even whose it is. And it is engravings by I'm going to mangle the pronunciation and lose some of the historic context that you guys will know better. But it goes to what you're saying, Sarah, about the travel narratives. It's an engraving by Theodore de Bry, or one of the de Bry brothers, who were responsible for all those first. In fact, I think Taschen or somebody's just done a big book of his redoing the giant prints of some of the first images of the Americas that were done with the Spanish, I guess, expeditions to the Americas. But these are these sort of infamous images he has. And I don't know if they're supposedly from the West Indies or actually someplace else in the Americas. They would be from, I'm guessing, the 1500s. If that makes sense, probably when, I'm not sure when de Bry is, or maybe the early 1600s. But in particular, it's depicting the cannibal habits of one of these tribes that the Spaniards or whoever have found. And so there's a set of images of this basically cannibal village involving a marketplace. And in it, you see what looks like quite mundane image of like kind of the butcher shop, but it is visibly human limbs that are there. And it's the classic image that we all still have more as like a New Yorker style cartoon, if anything, of like a pot with people in it with the fire under it. It's where a lot of our classic images of what cannibals look like. But so in the Lovecraft story, the guy's looking at this picture, which is purporting to be the de Bry engravings from the travel documents of what these horrible people do. And of course, there's a great jump scare because the old man is there lurking, in the house. And it becomes clear from the conversation they then have that the old man has become obsessed with those images too, to the point where he wanted to know what that would be like. And our spoiler alert, our narrator is going to have a narrow escape from ending up in effect in this guy's pot. So there you have in one of the landmark modern horror stories, something that connects back to the travel narratives you're talking about, Sarah, and even brings it to the point of what is the effect of such knowledge on people, and what would it mean to enact that now?
Right, and that sense of those you said earlier about this place where the rules sort of fall away, which Garth takes us to Lear, right? Maybe.
Yeah. Well,
or
you should go ahead, but I
no, go ahead.
So, because I was going to ask you, Adam, about so one of the things that I think of as distinguishing horror, not distinguishing it necessarily from tragedy, but something that is, you can see in the evolution, it is that horror is about breaking a genre that's about breaking boundaries, and maybe tragedy is too, but I sort of mean the boundaries of the genre as well. I was sort of thinking about, with tragedy, you have these classical rules, horrible things happen, but the most graphic of them happen off stage, and at least with the Greek tragedies. And then with Seneca, who is an inspiration to certainly to Marlowe and to Shakespeare, at least to a certain extent, he starts bringing those things on stage. So it's no longer, oh no, I've blinded myself off stage. Oh no, my mother/wife has committed suicide. It's now, let's watch it. Let's see people's hands chopped off on stage. Let's see eyes gouged out. Here I'm, thinking of Shakespeare in particular. And horror seems to me to be so it's something we're watching that's horrible, but also that we know we're not supposed to be watching. Like if we know the rules, we know that shouldn't happen on stage.
And that it might be actually dangerous to watch. And it's part of the implications, part of why I raised the Lovecraft story, picture of the house, because part of the implication there is that, and it's a kind of mise en abîme, right, of like the story and the picture within the story and the story within the picture, and going on and on and on, of the effect of that this might be dangerous to look at. In the same way that picture in the house, in the book in the house, is dangerous to look at, reading the story about the picture in the book in the house might be dangerous, and there is that sense of danger that comes. Good horror always feels dangerous to the viewer or to the reader, for sure. I don't know if these other classic texts had that. Just, equally on there, there are two things there. Yes, it seems to be tragedy and horror both have in common that they are both transgressive and about the consequences of transgressing. You know, it's probably, you could argue, less horror and maybe more classic tragedy, that it's purely about the consequences of transgression, of pollution, of miasma, as the Greeks would say, and all those things, or about the clash. And what's really tragic, I think we lost the sense that what's tragic in a lot of them is not, oh, sad things happen. What's tragic is that in the attempt to avoid specific transgressions, there are incommensurable goods in conflict that cannot be resolved. And that's the tragedy. Antigone, say, being the most extreme example, you know, that there's a really specific transgression that's been laid out by the king, in effect, of you know, what has to happen to the bodies of those who have tried to destroy the state, versus the equally absolute imperative on the part of Antigone herself to be facing some familial transgressions of allowing her brother's body to lie outside the gates of the city and be devoured by jackals. What's tragic, and there's other things going on in the play that are tragic, but fundamentally the tragedy is these are both functionally goods, in effect. They're both attempts to avoid inevitable transgression, but they are in inherent and incommensurable conflict. And the tragedy is in the conflicts of that, as it were. But equally, when you talk about, Garth, is it on screen or off screen, that never leaves, in the sense that that becomes the distinction even now between a more literary or artistic version of these things versus if I show it, you know. So it becomes the difference between Joyce Carol Oates or Stephen King, you know, or whoever you want to have as your examples of kind of the art horror versus horror.
Well, and it becomes too, so much of this is about a question of what are the rules that are surrounding the production of horror in the time when the horror is being produced. What are you permitted to show on stage? What are you permitted to put on film, right? When you get to a point where right now you can put pretty much anything on film, pretty much, right? Then it becomes an interesting question of what do you choose to put on film? And I remember, what was this, Signals, where they don't show the alien until really live. There was some Signs. Thank you. Yes, there was Signs came out, and there was a whole big discussion in the critical press about how you don't see the alien for like a really long time, if ever, right? And is that better? Does it make it artsier? Does it make it scarier not to see? Is it more frightening to see? And it's as special effects get better and better, as CGI gets less and less able to be distinguished from stuff that's really real, whatever that means.
Yeah.
Right. That gets into some really interesting questions, I think, for people who are making horror and people who are consuming horror. Like I will confess, having a very troubled relationship to the whole genre of horror. Perhaps much like a gothic heroine, right? I'm like fascinated by it, but I'm deeply disturbed by the fact that I am fascinated by it. I don't think it's particularly good for me. I don't think it's necessarily a super healthy genre for me to spend a lot of time with. And yet, right, I'm going to listen to that podcast about the lady dating the psychopath, right? I'm going to.
Right. Well, that raises that whole issue of the ways in which, at a certain, even not just post-enlightenment, but maybe post-enlightenment, I mean, more modern point, the points at which the crime story, particularly what we now call true crime, and we should remember that all crime stories began as claiming to be true crime. I mean, they all work together that way. Of how is that horror? I mean, a way to fling that back is, you know, well, okay. On the one hand, and in fact, I think may have been my first blessed encounter with Liberty Fund was, I think, the Frankenstein conference, which allowed me to, for the first time in years, return to reading the original Frankenstein, which for lots of reasons is always pointed to as the first horror novel, but equally the first science fiction novel, the first all kinds of things novels. It's true that out of that, there is that. And we could do a whole dive on that in terms of what's scary within it and what isn't, because some of it actually is. Also this issue of what's on screen and off screen in it, in a screen or on the page or off the page in it. And equally in terms of, is there, how much discussion within it is there about what's possible and not, or what are the rules of this universe? It's coming in a sort of Faustian tradition, let's call it, that says, there's somebody who's challenging the nature of reality itself and might be risking the opprobrium of the gods, not to mention of others, by crossing certain, man was not meant to go to, etc., certain places with that. So there's certain tropes that fundamentally come out of that. And I mentioned to say, okay, we're not even going to get into science fiction, but these things are born together, as is also romance, crime, all those. But the figure I wanted to point to quickly for a second is Poe, because Poe is the one that is most standardly seen as kind of the inventor of a number of genres in that sense. And if you look at the body of his work, or the body of his work that we still hold together, there is what we would now say, well, that's actually science fiction, because it's a story about the consequences of certain types of invention or whatever. Here's a story that might as well be a ghost story, or is a horror story in some way that we understand a horror story to be, right? Something supernatural, something rises from the dead, etc. Versus, or the appearance of death personified in the Mask of Red Death or whatever. But there's equally these stories that essentially are literally crime stories, both in the form of the detective, Arsène, Dupin, or whatever his name is, who's the pre-Sherlock Holmes first great detective who solves the mystery of the Rue Morgue and the mystery of Marie Roget, but also crime stories in an almost more modern sense, like The Black Cat or The Telltale Heart, or The Pit and the Pendulum, or The Cask of Amontillado, where someone commits some truly, truly horrible act and either psychologically melts down as it's found. As a kid obsessed with horror and doing these things, I used to kind of imagine a map. If you could do a map of genres and where you were, and I was trying to figure out where's horror, how does horror work? Well, it's like, okay, here's horror land, but it seems to have a border here with the crime novel. I mean, no one would mistake a pure police novel for being horror, and yet there's a whole swath of horror that is basically a crime story, whether it be a serial killer or whatever. But there's another whole side of it that seems to be science fiction, because we've invented this thing and now this has happened, versus there's a part of it that clearly touches on to what we mean by fantasy, in the sense of the existence of mythological creatures or things that were unknown. And there's a whole Gothic element that verges on romance. Oh, I've loved Ligeia, or the other lost women of Poe. So its borders, it's very porous. It's hard to say where those stop, and that have different degrees of reality. And I guess, to me, but they all point to, and this is really where that Enlightenment distinction, I think, comes from, and it's why Lovecraft, again, is so important, because he strips away a lot of things to get at the idea that the real horror might be that the universe is not okay. That not only is there not a benevolent order to things, that either there might be a malevolent order, kind of a Gnostic view, that in fact we're in the grip of an evil demiurge, or evil gods that are doing it, or, as in Lovecraftian and post-Lovecraftian horror, the ultimate horror might be we're nothing. We're so unimportant. We exist only for a moment in a universe that has no meaning, that doesn't have a central narrative to it, that isn't headed towards redemption or progress or anything. That the real atavistic horror running through horror is the potential utter meaninglessness of existence.
I mean, in that way, something, because I was thinking of another kind of horror or horror related story is something of like the nemesis, right? Where something horrible happens, but it's driven by good forces or by, I mean, in a way, hubris, if we think about hubris and tragedy, sort of works this way. Like something horrible happens, but you transgressed in some way to deserve what you get. And so it's like, I mean, it's not happy. We're not happy, but it is reassuring in a way that some of these other kinds of horror are not. I mean, I guess I'm also thinking, and I'm maybe dating myself here a little bit, but like the sort of model of the slasher movie
I was just
where
thinking,
the teenagers misbehaving. It's like,
right,
they're gone.
yeah, I was just
That
thinking that
one's
same
gone.
thing, yeah. Yeah, they smoked a joint in the woods and or they went off and made out and they shouldn't have, or had premarital sex, and therefore they're
Yeah.
gonna die.
Right, and the survivor is always the one who refrains
That's
from that, right?
That's right,
That's,
right.
you have the sort of the surviving kind of virgin character at the end, right? Which is a classic moment. So we only have about 5 minutes left, which is shocking to me. There's a jump scare for you,
There
right?
you
How
go,
did that happen? So let's play a quick round maybe of what's the scariest moment? What's the scariest thing? What's the big one for you that like you, because for me, the thing that I have never recovered from is the spectacular movie Wait Until Dark with Audrey Hepburn. And she's being, do you know this movie, Garth? She's being stalked, she's blind, being stalked through her apartment by a crazed killer. And she's going through and she's breaking all of the light bulbs in order to put them on an equal footing, or in fact, to put her on a superior footing, because she's can see in the dark better than he can. And, you know, it all comes to a great head. And then he opens the refrigerator door and the light bulb goes on the refrigerator. And I can't, I have goosebumps right now talking about it. I have never recovered from that moment. So what's your moment? And Adam, I bet you even have one, even inured as you must read all this. Yeah, Garth, what's your moment?
I'll go for the amateurs first, and then Adam.
Yeah.
can take us home. So mine is in part, I'm sure, the age that I saw this movie, and I probably don't even have the right name because I just saw it on TV. I think it's called The Godsend, and the story is about this family. They're about to have maybe their second child, maybe their first child, but they see this pregnant woman. They meet her in the park and she seems sort of lost. They invite her into their house and she has her child and disappears. And then as the children get older, it's essentially a cuckoo story. It turns out that her child is pushing the other children out of the nest, metaphorically. So and the movie was a pretty effective movie, I remember, but the moment is at the very end of the movie, after the family has survived-ish this event. They're in the park, they're maybe telling someone the story, but they're there. And all of a sudden, I think it's the father has this sort of jump take, freezes and says, "Oh my God." And the camera swoops across the park and you see the same woman, pregnant again, walking away with another family.
Yikes.
And I think there's
That's
a little
awesome.
more.
Now you make me want to go watch that movie.
But it's that
I gotta go watch that now.
I still remember it.
Great ones. It's always very tough when you would say, what's the number one? You know, there's no doubt that the most traumatic, and this is we have to have part 2 of this discussion will be when we discuss just the idea of trauma and the relation between trauma and horror and trauma in other forms. And there's a lot of interesting work that's been done on that. But I would say, yes, okay, my primal trauma was definitely The Exorcist. There's no doubt, for lots of reasons. And I will be dating myself to say, yes, I was seeing it on the big screen, probably even within the first week or so that it opened, at least when it opened in Chicago, which would have been pretty early in its run. And this is back in the day when movies didn't get released simultaneously all over the world, let alone on your TV, but you know, took a year to come to your small town if you were in a small town. That entire film, I mean, I could point to specific moments within it, but the terrors of what happened to Reagan, the girl in there, who was probably the exact age I was when I was watching it. And
what were you doing watching The Exorcist?
It's a funny thing. It's a mistake. It's a lucky mistake my parents made a few times, that because I was already really obsessed with horror, they didn't really have a great notion of which ones were appropriate or not. And we went as a whole group, the whole family went, you know, to see it together. And I remember, in fact, being in line, because there's a long line against the movie, and standing with my beloved older brother, so I was probably 11 or 12. He would have been maybe 14 or 15. and we're standing there in the marquee, and I knew nothing about it. This was not the typical horror movie that I knew about from reading Famous Monsters,
Yeah.
and it was a Hammer horror film or whatever. And I said to him, "What is this movie about anyway?" Because a lot of how you get ready for horror is to be prepared for it. And he said, "Oh, it's about blackmail. It's a crime thing. It's about blackmail." Which we only years later, when I would hear that, it's because he admitted it's because he had misread it and thought it was The Extortionist, and that he was being very sophisticated for knowing such a sophisticated word. But unfortunately, it meant that I walked in unprepared, not girded as one would be.
Yeah.
But here's the image I want to leave you with on that, because it's what I think unifies, Sarah, your example, and Garth's, and mine, if we were to go into why The Exorcist was so particularly horrifying to me. There's a film that you probably remember called The Blair Witch.
Yes.
We won't get off on why it was such an important film, but it was a very important film, 99, 2000, when it came out. God, it's almost 20 years, it's more than 20 years old now. And if our viewers, listeners here haven't seen it, it's definitely worth a look. It's a sui generis. It's up there with Night of the Living Dead or Texas Chainsaw. It's kind of one of its own unrepeatable kinds of horror films. But and it's one of the first of what we now call the found footage films, right? So it has great reality claim because it seems to all be pieces of real footage that was done. But the point I want to draw our attention to is kind of the culmination of the film. And part of the legend of the Blair Witch within the whole story is this idea that you will end up in the lair of the witch, standing in the corner, watching as she kills the victim just ahead of you, as it were. And that the peak moment of horror that it's identifying is this moment of being there, of seeing it happening, and knowing you're next. So the peak moment of horror is not before that being chased through the woods. It's not being the one getting it. It's that moment. And in a way, the moments we're all describing here are always that horror when it's work, in part because of its physiological levels, in part because of its psychological levels, in part because of levels we didn't get to really talk about, its political levels even, that when we're watching it, our bodies are attached to, our kind of vulnerable body is attached to those vulnerable bodies with the sense that we might be next. And that's the moment of maximum horror, is always that. You're next. You're watching through your eyes, thinking you could save yourself by not seeing, in the same way that as a kid you would think just your sheet covering you could keep you from whatever was under your bed.
So you've seen me watching horror movies, is what you're I think that is a glorious place to end. I wish we had another hour to keep talking. This has been spectacular.
Yes.
And deeply, deeply interesting, I think, about a genre that is much neglected by serious critics at large, and as with the other genres that we sort of touched on briefly, these other body genres, I think very interesting and very human, and thus very important to all of us over time. And so thank you very much, Adam Simon and Garth Bond, for joining me today. It was really a delight.
It was really great to see you guys and to talk about that.
Soundstripe. Soundstripe.